let's jump right in. What inspired you to pursue a career in venture capital?
Oh, so I did not pursue a career in venture capital. Unlike a lot of people, I fell into this industry, and I consider myself extremely blessed and lucky for that to be my story. It's interesting because at university, one of my favorite classes and the one where I got the highest marks was venture initiation. But what I took out of that class was that I could start a successful company, I could be an entrepreneur, but not that I could be the one writing the checks. So I was working for a small investment banking firm in LA focused on M&A transactions, and I just randomly updated my LinkedIn. Maybe 2 months later, I got a message from a gentleman in Australia, and he said, "You came up on a short list of candidates. I would love to help you further your career." For lack of better phrasing, I thought he was full of it, and I ignored the message for another 2 or 3 weeks. And so I was talking to my dad about it, and I said, "Got this weird message. Like, how funny is this?" And he said, "Well, before you discount it, why don't you, suss them out, do a little due diligence, and see if they're legitimate." Turns out they were. I reached out to the guy, followed up with him the next day. He immediately responded and said, "I'm on a 48-hour stint in LA. Can you meet for coffee tomorrow?"
From Australia.
Yes.
Just
Yes. So when someone goes from being,
serendipitously.
I don't know, 8,000 miles away to being in your backyard, you take the meeting. I went in thinking I'd hone my interview skills, meet a new person, walked out really wanting to work for his company. And he didn't even have a job description at the time. And so, the rest is history.
And what company was that?
This was Chimantium Capital, which is a multifamily office based in Australia.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So prior to joining True Culture Fund, you led business development as vice president of Chimantium Capital. Tell us about that experience. So you finally met him. You
Yes.
got the job,
Mhm.
obviously.
So I go through a 3-month interview process. I get the job. Actually, before that, when I sat down with him, he said, "I'll send you the job description in the next couple of days." So he sent the job description, and I had major imposter syndrome when I got it because the title was vice president. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so not qualified for this. And I was talking to my mom. My parents are amazing. I was talking to my mom, and she said, "Look at the qualifications. You possess all of the qualifications. You're intimidated by the title." And she said that, men apply for jobs based off of their potential. Women apply for jobs based off of their qualifications and credentials. She goes, "You have the potential to be great at this, and you also possess the qualifications. Go for it." So I did, went through the 3-month interview process, got the job, and I was brought on to be head of U.S. operations, business development, and investor relations. However, I was the only U.S. hire, which I didn't know going into this. So I was also tasked with diligencing and sourcing deals and curating a network of VCs and LPs, which are limited partners. So I was kind of thrown into the deep end of being a VC investor. And it was kind of sink or swim. And I like to say that I became somewhat of an Olympic swimmer because I had to.
Right. You Michael Phelps'd it.
I did.
No, that's fantastic. So thinking back to that time at Chimantium, where you were vice president, leading U.S. operations, like what was a takeaway for you? Something that you're really proud of or got you excited?
So again, because I was the one in the U.S. representing the firm, going to all of the dinners, summits, conferences, events, I found myself in rooms with very affluent and influential people. And I started to look around and realize that a lot of capital was being circulated in these rooms, but not a lot of capital was being circulated to people that looked like me. And so I've always been really passionate about leveling the playing field. And I started to look into how the racial wealth gap in this country correlates to the funding gap that you find in tech and venture, because people don't like to admit it, but this industry, tech and venture, it's very homogenous. I did research and started understanding that, it's good business to invest in underrepresented founders. Women are starting businesses at a higher rate than any other demographic, and the data proves that minority founders and female founders, or teams that have at least one minority or female founder as a part of the founding team, they outperform their contemporaries. And so I took these findings back to my managing director. I said, hey, I think that there's something here, and maybe we should launch an initiative to focus on these underrepresented founders. And he was very much on board with that idea. And so we launched 2065, and it was a fund with the sole goal of democratizing access to capital. That was my thesis. And I just felt like if you gave these underrepresented founders capital, resources, and access to a broader, more high-level network, that could help them scale their companies.
So that's an exciting experience. So essentially, while at Chimantium, you launched this fund for female founders?
Underrepresented founders.
Underrepresented founders.
Anyone that had a harder time gaining access to capital. Women, minorities, members of the LGBTQ community, veterans. It was a very broad, underrepresented thesis.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So now that you're knee deep in that, what did you learn? What did you take away from that experience?
We are resilient. And when I say we, I mean women of color. People that are underestimated will surprise you every time.
I love that. I love that. So tell me, how do you move on from that situation and end up at True Capital?
So in 2021, I decided I was ready for my next opportunity. I'd been introduced to my now partner, Travis Henry, who's at True Capital.
Go, Travis.
I'd been introduced to Travis because I was on the short list to run the fund for a pretty big celebrity. And that fund ended up not panning out. But Travis and I stayed in touch, and we'd find ourselves on 2-3 hour long conversations discussing and ideating on how to invest in Black innovation at scale. And so after one of those conversations, he said, instead of me, interviewing you to run someone else's fund, why don't you come and launch this fund with me? And that fund was True Culture Fund. And so True Capital is a wealth management firm that functions as a multifamily office, and we represent about 250 athletes and entertainers. The fund has been around, or the firm has been around for about 15 years. And since most of our clients are Black and brown, there's always been an intentionality around investing in diverse founders and fund managers. And so we launched True Culture Fund, and the thesis of True Culture Fund is to invest in Black founders and fund managers.
Amazing. So the big headline in national media for the last weeks relative to VC firms focused on underrepresented groups has been this lawsuit filed against the Fearless Fund and its entities. Let's just take a moment and talk about that. What do you have to say? What are you thinking?
WTF. So,
well, maybe it's a great opportunity for you to break it down, what's going on for those who aren't in the loop or quite understand what's going on.
Absolutely. So when I was reading over the case, for anyone that's interested in learning more, I think that Forbes and Rolling Stone did a great breakdown of what's going on.
Okay.
When I was reading over, exactly what's going on with this case, my blood pressure was up. My heart was pounding. I was shaking, and I'm pretty sure I shed a couple of tears.
You're getting emotional right now.
I know. It's crazy. So apparently this guy, Edward Blum, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, honestly, I don't care. Edward has made it his sole mission in life to dismantle legislation and legal precedent that has been around for decades to protect civil rights and civil liberties for minorities. And so it started with voting rights. Most recently, it was, affirmative action and striking down affirmative action. And now it is this case with Fearless Fun. Allegedly, a woman that is not a minority applied to the Fearless Fun nonprofit to receive a grant and realized that she could not be a recipient of that grant because she's not a Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so
or
I guess
women of color.
now I think that they've broadened their mandate,
Yeah,
but
they
I
have.
think originally it was for Black women.
Right.
She thought that that was reverse discrimination, which
Right.
I don't think is a thing. But that was her feeling, and she reached out to him and asked him to represent her in this case. So now he is claiming that their mandate of supporting women of color is illegal, essentially. And I think that what people are trying to understand right now is this a fruitless claim, or does this have merit?
Yeah.
And I've heard from some people, that have a background in law, that there's a good chance that they'll be victorious in fighting this.
The Fearless Fun.
The Fearless
That
Fun.
is our hope.
That is our hope.
That is absolutely
Yes.
our hope. So, what are your thoughts on the lawsuit? I think you kind of said it a little bit, but I also noticed that 70 women or 70 funds wrote an open letter or signed a petition in support of the Fearless Fund in this moment. And the Fearless Fund is a fund very much like the fund that you have,
Right.
with essentially the same thesis.
Yes. And the thing is, I have 2 points. There are a lot of funds that have a niche thesis. There are funds that focus on different sectors. There are funds that focus on, funding immigrants, funding, the Latinx community, funding African Americans. There are funds that focus solely on funding women. So,
Or categories, tech
yes,
versus consumer versus
absolutely,
fintech versus health tech,
absolutely,
healthcare.
absolutely. And so I think it's a bit egregious, and I don't think that it has a fair standing, honestly. How does it affect, my fund going forward? Fortunately for myself and Travis at True Culture, and it's interesting because I'm still fundraising, and I reached out to an investor recently, and she had a few questions. And the number one question was, do you plan to change your thesis in response to the lawsuit that was filed against Fearless Fun? And I responded and I said, absolutely not. And I think that we can do that because this is at True Capital, this is our 12th fund. We also have a generalist fund that, we invest in Black, white, Asian, whatever race, color, sector. It's generalist. We invest in, whomever and whatever we want.
As a corporation, you invest.
Yes.
Right.
We also have a fund that's focused on female founders. We have a fund that's focused on Latinx founders. And we have Culture Fund that's focused on Black founders. So I think that we just have offerings that allow us to be intentional, but we are not excluding anyone, essentially. So it doesn't really affect us, but I do worry that this will give already skittish investors, an excuse to pass on a fund that has a diversity lens on their thesis.
Well, I'd probably have to agree with you there based upon what you said and, fundraising and someone coming back to you in the last weeks. And that was the first question that they asked. In this climate, fundraising, it's kind of any excuse you can use, but it can be a real concern.
Absolutely.
For some LPs. So yeah, more on this developing story. And we just really hope for the best because at the end of the day, it's about the founders, and helping them have a shot at building wonderful businesses.
Absolutely. I will never understand why people believe that being more inclusive means that they're being excluded. I don't understand that. I think it's a win-win if you are more intentional about being inclusive.
Right.